E o passo superior seria uma possibilidade de síntese para poder interpretar o há e não há? Não seria filosoficamente mais fácil? Eu acho que o tempo é o grande óbice. Não daria por causa do problema do tempo. Mas formalmente talvez pudesse resolver o problema de um modo mais simples.
My answer is also no. Completely no. And I will explain why, because now I think it's easy to explain that. But it's a very important question, because at the beginning of Lupasco kind of philosophy, many people said, is not that just Hegel? And the answer has to do with the time, problem of time. It happens that I studied Hegel very carefully when I was a student in physics, because I was a student in Romania. And in Romania, in order to have examinations of physics, we had to have examination of materialism, dialectic materialism. It happened that I have a fabulous professor of materialist, dialectic materialist. Instead of studying Lenin, we studied Hegel. So I can answer your question. The problem with Hegelian triad, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, is that concerns a succession in time, like primitive society, capitalist society, non-A, and communist society, the T state. Now, the problem is that it concerns a succession in time, while here it concerns the same moment of time. So has no, A, non-A, and we have to begin to think in terms of 3 and not of 2. You see? At the same moment of time, it's like saying that we have 3 contradictories, not 2, 3. T, non-A, A, non-A, with in between them are contradictories at the same moment of time. Okay, so this is crucial, because so we can put the finger where is the Hegelian triad. Here, in the framework, will be on this segment. I mean, on this line, the Hegelian states, call it TH, will appear on the same level of reality, but at different moments of time. In other words, Hegelian triad corresponds to the third of Aristoteles. Aristotle thought everything. He thought excluded middle, included middle, and so on. Now, when you look in Aristotle, it's very interesting. He has a third. But I discussed that with René Thom at Pontifical Academy of Science in '92. René Thom is a fabulous knower of Aristoteles. And we discussed about this problem. And he accepted that, that the fact that in order to think about really a third included middle, you have to jump. You don't have to stay on this segment. While the fake third state, Hegelian third state, has to be on the same line. Yeah. Sorry, I retired the word fake. It's not fake. It's a different T state. Yeah.
Vou falar em português também, não?
Sure. 1 second.
O ponto é que se trata de estabelecer uma forma
One
de...
second. No. Doesn't work. It worked just before. No. I don't understand. It works. It works, okay.
Trata-se de se estabelecer uma certa relação entre um nível de informação que existe no plano do objeto, do mundo exterior, da realidade, e um outro volume de informações ou um sistema de informações que é referente ao sujeito. Naquele tipo de esquema em que se criam vários níveis de realidade, todas elas coexistindo no tempo, cada nível de realidade podendo abranger vários sistemas organizados dentro do mesmo nível de organização, tanto no lado do objeto como no lado do sujeito. Uma das características de qualquer atividade é a mudança. Se há alguma coisa que caracterize, digamos, a organização, tanto ao nível cósmico como ao nível da relação da vida, é um sistema de mudança. Nada é estático, tudo muda de acordo com uma determinada ordem que permanece apesar do processo de mudança. De que maneira é que se pode imaginar esta forma de organização, fácil de entender quando se a imagina do ponto de vista estático, quando o processo se projeta no tempo? Um primeiro ponto.
But if we can take question by question, because we are all tired, it's good to answer to the same question. It's a really excellent question, because I couldn't speak about these kind of things because of time. And it's again connected with the nature of time. When we say change, usually we think about the change in four-dimensional space-time. This means the time and space which is associated with our body is an anthropomorphical representation of space and time. I quote Pauli, anthropomorphic representation of space and time, 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. Now, when you have different levels of reality, different levels of perception, the point is that every level is associated, in principle, with a different space-time, different from form. For example, quantum level connected with, say, 27 dimensions or 11 dimensions. For us, it's a triviality. I mean, physicists, it's a triviality, the fact that we can work in much more dimensions than 3 to 1, 3 plus 1. And these supplementary dimensions, and just take this example, are necessary for eliminating inconsistencies of the theory, of the approach, of the experiments, and so on. So it's a necessity. Now, what means change in 11 dimensions? Can you imagine? Say, even 1 dimension of time and 12, I don't know, 10 dimensions of space. We cannot imagine. We are built to think only in terms, our representations, our images are all based on 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time representations. Mathematics, yes, can go beyond that. It's a special language, not images. Images are fake. There is no image in 4 dimensions. Impossible, by definition, because one cannot put an image of 4 dimensions in 3 dimensions. So, what I try to say by that, the transdisciplinary approach gives to the notion of change something, I think, much deeper and much wider, much richer than the notion, classical notion of change, which is just associated with a space-time, and not any time, is a time-oriented time. A time with an arrow, irreversibility of time, the famous the time going only in one direction. Now, in these multidimensional approaches, time can go in both directions. Quantum physics, there's reversibility in time. So you see, I'm saying all that, just understand that is a huge field of research to deepen the notions of change, for example, from this transdisciplinary point of view. Taking models, for example, why not? Because we cannot just remain in a very abstract description and so on. Say that you modelize the next level to have 11 dimensions. Why not? You modelize the next one to have 27. And you try to see what means change. Economical change, political change, spiritual change. Will be interesting.
Outro ponto.
Yeah. Yeah.
Outro ponto é que nesse processo de mudança que ocorre tanto na área do objeto como na área do sujeito, apesar de haver sinais de que mudanças ocorrem, existe alguma coisa que permanece. Há um nível de informação que permanece ao longo do tempo e que, de certa forma, coordena o processo de mudança. Isto ocorre tanto no sistema macrofísico como no outro sistema. O sistema não é totalmente aleatório, ele é, na verdade, coordenado por alguma forma de informação. Essa forma de informação tem algo a ver com o terceiro incluído. E ela pode coexistir em cada um dos lados do problema, tanto ao lado do objeto quanto ao lado do sujeito. Há um nível de informação, aparentemente, que existe além daquilo que o senhor chama do sacred. Seria talvez um outro sistema de informação. Por outro lado, um terceiro ponto é que se trata, na verdade, de estabelecer um certo ponto de equilíbrio entre aquilo que é o concreto, acessível, digamos, a uma postura racional, que é o objeto da ciência, exata, se possível, e aquilo que seria, do ponto de vista humano, a atitude subjetiva de evoluir para a abstração. Eu acho que ao longo do conhecimento humano nós sempre estivemos, na verdade, convivendo entre a necessidade de ver a realidade objetiva e, por outro lado, de certa forma, estar presos à condição humana de desenvolver percepções que são, na sua essência, subjetivas. Um dos pontos que realmente se tornam complexos nesse tipo de análise, e realmente aí se aplica bem o conceito de complexidade, como nós o entendemos hoje, é exatamente estabelecer, por parte do indivíduo, que é o sujeito, até que ponto, na verdade, é a abstração que ele faz, que, na verdade, a visão dele é metafórica sobre a realidade, até que ponto ele consegue ter uma percepção coordenada.
Can you repeat the question again? I didn't get.
O ponto é que, sendo, digamos, a atividade do sujeito essencialmente subjetiva, por necessidade, não por opção, mas por necessidade, pela condição humana, aquilo que já foi levantado antes por outros autores, Kant, inclusive, eu já mencionei isso no primeiro encontro, qual é exatamente a segurança que se pode ter, do ponto de vista subjetivo, de estar tratando de uma forma adequada aquilo que parece ser o fenômeno objetivo. Como isto se coloca dentro da sua visão daquilo que é a percepção da realidade?
Well, it's very deep. It's so deep that I don't know if I can answer. I mean, it's
You can.
it's very deep. The only thing I would like to mention, I think that we can discuss privately a lot of questions, but one thing is that I didn't say there is information all over the region of levels of perception. I use the word consciousness. And this is precise, is because information can work, logically speaking, only in the region of levels of reality, the notion of information. And I never prolonged the notion of information in the region of the sacred, which would be a contradictory term with what I said, that nothing can be said. So I think that the complexity model you are looking for will have an answer when the question of consciousness will be more seriously discussed from this transdisciplinary point of view. In fact, myself and friends of mine, we try to attract some biologists, some neurophysiologists, to think about levels of reality in consciousness. But it's very difficult because biologists look like, again, physicists of the 19th century. They have no mathematics, no formalization. Theory and experiment are completely mixed. So to speak about levels is already extremely complicated. And we try to convince them at least to begin to look at experimental level. Even if there is not very developed theory, it will be already a huge jump, huge step. And after that, perhaps we can come to your type of question. It's my opinion. Yes.
Primeiramente, eu queria dizer que foi extremamente confortável.
1 second. Yeah.
Primeiramente, eu gostaria de dizer que foi extremamente confortável ouvir a sua conferência hoje, depois do ano passado, de ter lido o Manifesto da Transdisciplinaridade, das nossas poucas discussões na lista. Então, nós estamos, mais ou menos, navegando em alguma coisa que a gente está conseguindo enxergar. Então, foi muito interessante. E a primeira questão que me fica da sua exposição de hoje é, ao falar da cultura científica e da cultura humanista, né? O senhor colocou que a cultura humanista transitava tanto pelos níveis de percepção quanto pelos níveis de realidade, se eu entendi bem, e a cultura científica transitava apenas nos níveis de realidade. Está correta a minha percepção?
Yes.
Então, me parece, então, uma vez que a cultura humanista transita nos dois lados do diagrama, o problema, na verdade, está na cultura científica. Então, a transdisciplinaridade me parece que é a tentativa da ciência, se posso dizer, de estabelecer um diálogo com a ciência humanista, ou com a cultura humanista, melhor dizer, não é? Seria isso mesmo?
No.
Não?
No. No, transdisciplinarity is not an attempt of science to establish a dialogue with culture. It's equally an attempt of culture to establish a dialogue with science. I mean, it's not the starting point there. It's putting science at the top of the hierarchy and saying it's dialoguing with culture, humanistic science, and so on. No. The problem is what is in between science and culture. What is in between different realms of knowledge. That's transdisciplinary. It's not about one trying to dialogue with the other. Okay?
Muito bem, obrigado.
One second.
A minha questão
I
continua.
have a technical problem. 1 second.
Quebrou lá. Quebrou. Então, a minha questão, então, agora mais objetivamente, está talvez dentro daquilo
Not objective.
Sim, okay. Não, objetivamente.
We can try to apply the language slowly,
Okay.
right?
Talvez objetivamente, porque eu acho que isso diz respeito à nossa, como volto a dizer, as nossas poucas discussões na lista. Mas, às vezes, quando se fala dos níveis de realidade, e se fala de níveis mais baixos ou inferiores e níveis superiores, né, me vem uma impressão de hierarquia, né? E às vezes eu observo, talvez no discurso transdisciplinar, uma tendência a falarmos de níveis superiores como hierarquicamente superiores, né? E aí me parece que há uma distorção do pensamento. Se eu posso entender, me pareceu ainda, que o diagrama, como um diagrama aberto, como uma proposta aberta, ela talvez seja, neste diagrama, seja possível a autoconstrução. Né? Então, quer dizer, talvez níveis de realidade se construam. Né? Nós não estamos falando de uma realidade do real, talvez, aí, acabado, mas de um real que está em construção constantemente. Né? Então, se nós não podemos julgar uma cultura ou um nível de realidade por um nível, e sendo aquele um nível privilegiado, porque não existe nível privilegiado, essa fala talvez tenha uma tendência a hierarquizar, então, julgar um nível inferior como realmente inferior, no sentido moral da palavra, né? Eu gostaria que o senhor falasse um pouco sobre isso.
Yeah. So let's go back to the diagram, because it's really an excellent question for understanding this problem of hierarchy or not hierarchy, and it's important to compare with old descriptions of cultures, religions, connect with the problem of hierarchy. It's very important. So, here apparently there is a new hierarchy, like you observed. Apparently, because will be hierarchy. This means a level more important than the other, let's put in a familiar language. If there was not these loops who in fact put them on equal footing. So there is order because there is transmission of information. It's an arrow. It's not hierarchy. So it's not anarchy, because there is order. Now, it's not hierarchy, because it's not one level which is more important than the other, because you can cut one of the levels here, and you destroy everything. So the real word which perhaps we can use in this framework will be heterarchy. Right? This means the fact that we speak about an importance of something connected with the presence of the other all the time, with the heterarchy, the other. Now, in the if you apply naively in the religious realm this kind of considerations, this would mean some apparently heretical kind of statements, like saying that God doesn't exist without a man, for example. There's no hierarchy. And it's very interesting that similar ideas appear in a man who's more or less heretic, again, which called Jacob Böhme. When he said, for example, in one of the works, Jesus lives with the prayers of the people, is nourished, eating. God can be born, he says, Jacob Böhme. Now, these symbolic words, these of other centuries, you can understand now in our modern language, not by an interpretation, but try to understand what they can mean in this hierarchical, etherical kind. So, will be like a heterarchy. Is a new kind of vision, even in the framework, not only social, teams, collectivities. What will mean, for example, a hierarchy in an enterprise? Will be very interesting. Doesn't mean that will be not boss, will be not a leader, will be not a professor who is chairing a department. But the point is that will be a permanent change, a flux. It's a new way even for organizing teams. Transdisciplinarity is very concrete. You can go from God till the teams in enterprises with this model of heterarchy. You see? Okay. This means is the end? Or you just are glad with the answer? It's an ambiguous yes. You are glad with the answer, or you want to be the end? Well, we have our big chiefs here. So you decide. Americo, Maria, Vittoria. Two more questions.
A gente vai ser rápida. Eu já não sei mais nem que língua eu pergunto. Bassarab,
Yeah.
je me sens très petite, très humble
Moi
par
aussi.
rapport à tout ce que vous avez dit. Mais pour moi, la philosophie n'est pas une discipline. Et au long de l'histoire de l'humanité, la philosophie est un effort pour maintenir vivant une attitude. Et une attitude d'apprentissage et une attitude...
Dites ça à votre chef de département de philosophie, il va vous dire ce qu'il pense. Moi, je parle du point de vue des règles instituées dans l'université. Du point de vue des règles instituées dans l'université, la philosophie est une discipline parmi d'autres. Comme la théologie est une discipline, c'est une science humaine. C'est pas l'étude des mystères du monde.
Oui.
Vous parlez du sentiment philosophique, ce
Oui.
qui est très différent.
Oui.
Vous ne parlez pas de la philosophie en tant que discipline. Vous parlez du sentiment philosophique. Bien sûr, dans ce sens-là, c'est un nouveau sentiment philosophique.
Bon,
Bien sûr.
parce
Oui.
que c'est un petit peu ce qui a orienté toutes mes recherches.
Bien sûr.
Si vous voulez.
Sentiment
c'est-à-dire,
religieux, sentiment philosophique.
Qu'est-ce qui pourrait nous relier et qu'est-ce qui pourrait peut-être définir une attitude transdisciplinaire? Et ce serait la question de l'apprentissage et
Oui.
du savoir ignorer, du savoir ne pas savoir, et qui est pour moi quand même un retour aux sources à Socrate, même si, bon, aujourd'hui, effectivement, on a une chaire et on enseigne la philosophie comme une discipline. Mais c'était, je pense que c'est une
D'accord.
piste.
Absolument.
Voilà.
Absolument d'accord. Oui. Martin, yeah.
Is this working?
Just,
This is
yes.
this is a very interesting model. It seems to have its origins both in your work on Boma as
Yeah.
well as your work in quantum mechanics and dimensional models of quantum events.
Yes.
Okay. The question that I have in the use of this model with a mystical as well as I'm sorry, I didn't mean to use that word, in a heterodox philosophical tradition as well as a orthodox scientific tradition. What is the status of X for the analogy to transdisciplinary inquiry? Is it a thing, an object of perception, or is it an event? And I'm asking that question because I'm wondering what happens to the processes in response to X as object or event when we have moved to the next event and the next event and the next event and the next event. To use another analogy connected to subjective experience, by analogy to Boltzmann's order principle, in which we have to reconstruct the past and the future from one moment to the next, perpetually contingent. What is the status of X, and what's the role of time in relationship to X?
Hola. I have only deep questions tonight. First of all, let's clarify something connected with the uniqueness or non-uniqueness of X. I said that logical necessity of this X is just to ensure the connection between the flux of consciousness here and flux of information here. So this means that can be one, but can be many points, x prime, x second, x third, and so on. So you see, typically already to what it points out, this very fact that is not uniqueness. So can approach to monotheistic religions, for example, or polytheistic religions. All are equally possible for this kind of description. It's not selecting one.
Could I follow up?
Sure. Please.
There is a structure in this diagram, and there are flows in the diagram.
Sorry?
There is a structure presented in the diagram,
Yeah.
and there are flows presented in the diagram.
Yeah.
The flows are in some way catalyzed by what you're calling X.
Well,
What is the
yeah,
status
yes and no. Yeah.
of X? And does X move in time? And if it does move in time, is it possible, for the purposes of analysis, to isolate X out of the contingent nature of the arrow of time,
Very good.
which has to do with our shared
Yeah.
lived experience?
Yeah. Strictly speaking, has nothing to do with the arrow of time. For the reason I explained before, that this level of reality has a different space-time from this one. This one has a different, for example, just to imagine, to modelize multidimensional space-times, but different from one level to the other. So when you arrive here, there is no more time. No time.
So you are really trying to describe a timelessness in lived experience?
No. No. Will be very binary. Is timelessness in connection with time? Both. I mean, when you make your meditation every morning, Martin, I think you make your own, you jogging or meditation, doesn't matter. You make meditation or jogging? What is meditation? Meditation. When you make your meditation, can you say, can you say that your experience is non-time? Your experience is time. If we are honest, we have said both. Because this body remains in time. Whatever we are doing. When we will die, of course, something can happen. We were not yet there to say. Right? But here and now, we are in time, our bodies. But what we experience sometimes gives the test of non-time. So both are present. It's so difficult to accept that both are present, you see. So this description is given here is a framework to begin to think in terms of contradictories, like I said to the lady before, thought at the same moment of time. 3. Right? So non-time. So now if we come to some modelization of that this is not to be distributed, what I'm saying now, because I'm not sure about. The only model I know as a physicist, which approaches very much what I'm thinking here, is paradoxically a cosmological model given by Gödel himself. Gödel was not only a logician, also a cosmologist, also a philosopher. He was many things. And he invented a cosmology in which the time is circular. But it's not circular in the sense of Eliade, in the sense of cyclic time. It's not cyclic time. It's simply circular. This means in some sense that we can act on our past. So in that sense, I would say it's the only one is a solution of general relativity, which Einstein considered as completely fantasy, but cannot be rejected on mathematical level of Gödel. He poses the question of causality, of course, you see? So it's the only model I know. Paradoxically enough also, I don't know why, from 2 years now, 3 years, people began to discuss more and more and more about this Gödelian type of cosmology, but perhaps it's a cultural fashion. I don't know.
Thank you.
As janelas do fundo, acho que as duas últimas, por favor.
I would like to express my appreciation to Maria de Mello and Vittoria and Americo for inviting me to speak here as a foreign expert. And it seems to me that the best thing to do to begin with is to destroy my ethos as an expert. I'm going to talk about a mathematician, a philosopher, and an artist based on my expertise with a PhD in English. There's a famous commercial, famously stupid commercial on American television where a soap opera star who plays a doctor gets up in front of the camera and says, I'm not a real doctor, but I play one on TV. I see that we have a conference on transdisciplinarity, which is being filmed in video. So let me just express the anxiety that I have for the transdisciplinary project by first saying, according to the words of Jamie Robbie Robertson, the rock star from the late 1960s, early 70s, who said, see the man with the stage fright.
Speak a little louder.
He said, can you see the man with the stage fright standing up there giving it all his might? He got lost in the spotlight, but when he got to the end, he wanted to start all over again. So let me encourage you also to come tomorrow, same time, same station, where I will address more directly the anxieties that we have over transdisciplinary inquiry by looking at the question of metaphor. So on that note, I would like to begin with a short segue from Bazarab's talk last night, which was a brilliant evocation of the complexity of the event and the ways in which we can cognize that event. By reference to a couple of diagrams that have some bearing on what I want to talk about today. Here we have a picture of an event cone for simple dynamical systems. The cone refers to the past and the future, and where the lines intersect is what we might call the event, which might be also talked about as the present. I'll focus. Oh. The cones refer to what is possible to construct in terms of strict causality. What occurs inside the cone with reference to the past will lead to an event inside the cone in the future, right? That suggests a range of possible events. In terms of both the past and the future, anything outside the zone in what's called the elsewhere zone represents a zone of impossibility, it seems. Now, this is in reference to simple events, but as we know, we do not have the cognition often to recognize when events we are not aware of will impinge upon our future with respect to what we can know. And I'm also interested in pointing out that the ability to be in the present and to project the future suggests that you have control over what you're able to see from what has occurred in the past. Very simply. But there's another diagram which, if you take this axis and rotate it 45 degrees, where this is the present, and this is with respect to space and time, then these dots represent a range of possible futures given this momentary event. Now, what kind of a person can recognize the range of possible futures and decide which futures we are going to try to develop and those that we're going to try to avoid? With respect to physical systems, this is the point where we begin to give up the claim that we have absolute certain control over the past, present, and future with respect to either modeling or enacting dynamical systems, and begin to accept a model of statistical and contingent reality. And I think the hierarchies that Bazarov was talking about and the flows that Bazarov was talking about is very resonant in the word from Poincaré with what I see is at stake in Poincaré and Bergson's work. On that note, let me begin. Let me briefly tour the terrain first. I'm going to talk about Duchamp's posthumous great work, Étant donné. The English translation is given, or as I will argue, being given, won the waterfall to the illuminating gas in the Philadelphia Museum. I will then look at the language associated with Duchamp's writings on Étant donné and discuss Poincaré's popular writings on mathematical creativity, on mathematical discovery in the collection Science and Method. I will then look at the relationship between Poincaré and Bergson in terms of creativity with respect to the terms contingent duration, memory, and élan vital. I will then look at the word ready-made, tout fait, and ask the question that the detective journalists asked about the Watergate scandal. What did they know and when did they know it? Then I will briefly and incompetently talk about Ensemble's theory of groups in phase space in order to talk about the complex n-dimensional realities that Poincaré and Bergson were interested in. and to point to Duchamp's own absolute fascination with this theorizing. I will then talk about the context of Duchamp with respect to the French putative cubists such as Gleitz and Metzinger, and talk about Duchamp's relationship to Cubism with respect to Bergson's critique of geometry. And then I will suggest that Duchamp and Bergson, I will argue that even though a lot of people think that Duchamp did not like Bergson, that Duchamp's move to Poincaré is the move to Bergson's source in the face of nonsensical Bergsonism. And then I think my punchline will be Bergson is to Poincaré as Kant is to Newton and Leibniz, representing a whole nother model of the world centered in complexity, contingency, and self-organization. Then I will briefly talk about the limits of Poincaré's critique of geometry with respect to the concept of conventionalism, and then I will come back to On Mathematical Discovery in order to talk about Poincaré and Bergson's notion of the evolution of systems of thought. And then I will look at Duchamp's notions of perception with respect to the problem that Bazarab presents by using the language of the time image and the movement image, and using two works by Duchamp to illustrate Bergson's comments. Then I will talk about Duchamp's most famous work, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even, and then talk about an interesting phenomenon where Duchamp decided to shoot a toy cannon, pencils with a toy cannon at the large glass when it was assembled, and then drilled holes into the glass, and talk about the fact of why are those holes there. And then I will talk about these holes as portals, and then come back to étant donné, or being given, and you'll see why in a moment. So I'm afraid that this is going to be a little bit long, but maybe I can find ways of cutting as I proceed. In the Philadelphia Museum in 1968, a work was constructed and finished and shown for the first time only after Duchamp had died. And the astonishment of the art world was complete because everyone assumed that Duchamp had retired from the production of art at least 20 years ago, if not more. And if you go to the Duchamp room, and the Philadelphia Museum is the best collection in the world of Duchamp artifacts, you can actually miss this work because it's in a darkened, short, kind of dead-end hallway in the back of the room. And the estimates are from 50 to 66% of the people who enter the room never even know and see the work, which is probably Duchamp's final joke. But I think there's more to the joke in the sense of meta-irony, which means that it's not just a cynical joke, but there is affirmation in the joke as well as denial. So, if you know that the room is there, you walk down the darkened hallway and come up to this medieval door. And in the medieval door, there is a chink about right here. And
if you look in that chink, you will see a somewhat erotic scene. And immediately the response is self-conscious because all of a sudden the viewer is in the position of being a voyeur. But Duchamp's meta-irony is complete because one can read this tableau with respect to iconography, and therefore by narrativizing that iconography one can come up with allegory. You cannot see very well, and I'm sorry for the quality of the prints here. There is a waterfall right here that is actually electric. It runs. It is a simulation of a waterfall. Here is a gas lamp, which is lit. And here is the construction of a woman on a frame stretched with pigskin, in which, and painted flesh-colored, in which one can see the indecorous entry of the womb. If I were to provide a strong reading of this tableau, I would argue that the iconography and therefore the allegory is as such. The portal is an entry into a new world of thinking. Now, I'm going to ironize my own allegory in a moment, so bear with me, those of you that have come to know the sophistication of skeptical models of interpretation, which I happen to like, but which I'm temporarily putting in abeyance. The waterfall and the flow of water is an old reference to the arrow of time. The behavior of the gas molecules that provide the illumination in this tableau refers to the properties of entropic systems which are perpetually contingent. So we have irreversible time, and we have the principle of contingency. We have the element of complexity and distribution, because we're not just talking about things, we're also talking about the self-consciousness of the viewer who brings the tableau to life with reverberating levels of signification, of which my allegory represents a part. And the entrance to the womb is the entrance to the site of gestation, where local organs spontaneously organize themselves into a global body and represent the principles of emergence. So we have irreversibility, we have contingency of complex systems, we have the distribution of complex systems, and we have the properties of emergence. This allegory, however, becomes complicated if we examine the notes to the large, to Étant donné, which Duchamp insisted would not be published until 20 years after the unveiling of this tableau. And the notes were published in 1988, 20 years after the introduction to Étant donné. This is a picture from the notes to Étant donné. And the notes to Étant donné are notes which
help in the actual physical and mechanical creation of the work of art, and therefore represents a mirror inversion of another work and its notes, the large glass, the bride stripped bare by her bachelors even, and the notes which was revealed in 1923 and was presented definitively unfinished, and the green box notes to large glass, which were published in 1933. The notes to large glass provide an entire system of interpretation for the glass assemblage, whereas the notes for étant donné offer not interpretation, but the notes for creativity, for the actual creation, the physical creation of the work of art. And if you look at the floor of the ensemble in its process of creation, you see a chessboard, a series of chessboard squares. Now, I'm going to talk about chess in a moment, but if you notice, the chessboard squares are not continuous. In fact, you can see that there seems to be several distinct planes intersecting of the chess board motif, which suggests intersecting planes of chessboards, which in turn suggest intersecting planes of time-space geometry, which is, after all, what chess models. Duchamp was a master of chess. He was the president of the French team that competed internationally. And in 1967, he was the president of the American team that took Bobby Fischer into international play for the first time. He played François Leliène in 1932 for the Paris tournament, the mathematician, game theorist, and founder of the Oulipo movement, the literature potential movement, an avant-garde movement which includes Italo Calvino. And they played together in 1932. In 1932, Duchamp published with Itali Halberstadt, Attoli, I think, I can't remember the name, a treatise on endgame strategy, which is a major focus of my own research. The title of the chess treatise is Opposition and Sister Squares Reconciled. And the purpose of the chess treatise is at endgame, when all you have are two kings and maybe one or two pawns on the chessboard, how can the kings position themselves in order to avoid defeat? And the only way that they can avoid defeat at this stage is if both kings conspire to play the same kind of game with the same kind of complex geometry of opposition, so that the purpose of the game is to delay the end of the end game as long as possible. It is so overdetermined as a system of geometry that the game will go on forever unless the irreversible contingency of a mistake creeps into the system, which precipitates the end of the end game. And the way that they produce the condition of opposition is they take the chessboard, they eliminate one row to make the asymmetrical chessboard symmetrical. They fold it, they invert it, they fold it, they invert it, and then they fold the chessboard so that the kings, the two subjectivities, are coming out of the same square. If the two subjectivities of the kings come out of the same square, then opposition is preserved. If one makes a mistake, there is breach of opposition, which represents a moment of aporia or disintegration, and it precipitates the loss of one side and the winning of another. You cannot win using this chess treatise, you can only avoid defeat. So I would suggest the mirroring and the inversion of the chess treatise is like the mirroring and inversion of large glass and its interpretation at the beginning of his complex period, and the work Étant donné and the notes for its creation. But I've gone a little bit far afield. What's important here is that not only do we have the allegory of self-organization that we peer through a portal as if into a new world of thought, as well as visual iconography, but we also have invisible to this world a being given, a reversible perspective of time upon which this tableau is constructed. What Duchamp seems to be doing here is representing epistemological warfare between irreversible and reversible systems. What's interesting is that the iconography of the bride stripped bare by her bachelors even represented in terms of the mechanism of the Industrial Revolution, and involves the production of desire through the mechanisms of the bachelors with respect to a transcendent bride. And the Industrial Revolution, to a certain extent, is an embrace of the domination of irreversible processes by reversible processes, such as the reversible movement of engines, so that the dynamics of engine design actually reflect the attitude towards time, that time is deterministic and one can see the laws of nature moving forwards and backwards in time. Now, this is a strong reading. And it is a reading based on the fact that we can read Prigogine now on self-organizing systems, and we can read Varela on emergent properties and cognitive science, and we can read Gilles Deleuze on an evaluation of cognitive and cultural systems from a self-organizing systems perspective. What I perhaps should do now is to quickly review what those are. But maybe I can save that for later. I actually have, in a sense, outline. Would it be useful for you folks to see those? The basic principles of self-organization or emergence in Prigogine, Varela, and Gilles Deleuze. Now, if I can only find what I did with it. I'm sorry. Wait, maybe if I move this here. And go in here. Here are the principles of emergence for Prigogine. Unlike classical dynamical systems, which depend upon the assumption of certainty, the capacity for precise geometrical mapping, and the adherence to the reductionist project in locating simple, immutable laws, we can characterize self-organizing systems by the following. They are complex, too many elements to the system to be able to represent precisely the behavior of one entity within it, such as molecules of gas. They are contingent. The history of a complex system is unstable, with the range of possible outcomes from one moment to the next. They are irreversible with respect to time because the arrow of time implies evolution, whether towards greater order as in living systems or towards greater disorder as in equilibrium thermodynamics. The Mazda Miata can turn into a pile of rust, but the pile of rust will never remember what it's like to be a Mazda Miata. They are also dissipative. The system is open, and in exchanging energy or information with the outside, the system can evolve. They are emergent. Simpler forms interact, take on new and more complex properties, not necessarily predictable from the behavior of those simpler forms. That's in a field of non-equilibrium thermodynamics, the work of which on self-organizing systems won Prigogine the Nobel Prize in chemistry, not physics, even though one could argue that this is work in physics, in 1977. Here's Francisco Varela. Just as I opposed reversible and irreversible systems, I'm going to oppose top-down and bottom-up cognitive paradigms. And the best way to do this is the way that Varela does it, I think, in The Embodied Mind and in a number of other works where he's presented this. What is cognition? Information processing as symbolic computation, rule-based manipulation of symbols. How does it work? Through any device that could support and manipulate discrete functional elements, the symbols. The system interacts with the form of the symbols, their physical attributes, but not their meaning. How do I know when a cognitive system is functioning adequately? When the symbols appropriately represent some aspect of the real world and information processing leads to a successful solution of the problem given to the system. But this limits computation to the level of the manipulation of symbols and is a top-down architecture. It's like a house of cards. If you pull one card out of the house, the whole house will collapse. And you probably experience this, hopefully not every day, with your own top-down computer. In your office, when a single software program crashes, it crashes your entire computer, no? And the reason for that is its top-down computational architecture. Varela is one of the major figures who have been a part of the what's called the emergent and inactive or distributed cognitive schools that have come to replace the top-down school as the dominant field of current research in cognitive science and artificial intelligence. So here are the same questions from this different perspective, also from The Embodied Mind and elsewhere where Varela has published this. Question 1, what is cognition? The emergence of global states in a network of simple components. Question 2, how does it work? Through local rules for individual operation and rules for changes in the connectivity among the elements. How do I know when a cognitive system is functioning adequately? When the emergent properties and resulting structure can be seen to correspond to a cognitive activity, a successful solution to a required task. Here we have rules governing simple operations which then combine to form complex operations that cannot be predicted by the rules governing the simple systems. So that a mainframe computer organized along the architecture of the top-down computational paradigm is not nearly as powerful a computing system as a network of small computers networked into a system through a server which can generate more power than the sum of the individual computing elements. And actually, the Mac G4 has some parallel processing elements. It is capable of running multiple tasks simultaneously. If you crash one piece of software, its architecture will not, therefore, collapse along with the single software program. So now philosophy. The properties of rhizomes in Deleuze and Guattari's work, which has a history in the work of the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, which goes back to his original study of Hume called Empiricism and Subjectivity, the title of which I'd like to come back to in a few moments. He talks about rhizomes. A rhizome, if you are not familiar with it, is a phenomenon that exists in the real world. It represents the point when individual living units or entities can aggregate into larger structures so they become a unity larger than the sum of their constituent parts. Examples of rhizomes are pampas or prairie grasslands, where the root systems of an individual blade of grass becomes implicated in the root systems of other blades of grass. And the root system actually becomes an extended living form independent of the individual blades of grass which constitute it. Another example is fungus. And in fact, under a second succession forest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, they discovered an aggregating fungus that is over a square mile large. It as yet does not have a name, but what I would like to do is to give it a name, and I'd like to call it Henri. So the principles of the rhizome, according to Deleuze and Guattari, are connectivity, the capacity to aggregate; heterogeneity, the capacity for unlike elements to coordinate; multiplicity, the variability of connections are at a maximum; a signifying rupture, which allows the system to function despite local breakdowns; cartography, as inadequate to representation. A rhizome is not amenable to any structural or generative model. In other words, it is not reducible to geometry. It is not reducible to certainty. It is not reducible to simple and immutable laws. And decalcomania, the condition of infinite flexibility, adaptability, and resistance to rigidity. So, this is the context for understanding the allegory. And in 1968, there was a context for Duchamp to have these kinds of thoughts. The work of Henri Otland, the work of Ilya Prigogine, Norbert Wiener, and John von Neumann's speculations on artificial life as a becoming capable of generating its own evolutionary trajectory, as in nanotechnology that we now understand. The problem with this reading of this allegory is the problem of Duchamp's place in 20th century history, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about Duchamp today. Because the notes that describe the conceptual material for étant donné are actually not in the notes for the construction, physical construction of the of étant donné, but in the notes for the interpretation of the large glass, notes which actually predate the creation of the large glass itself. And in fact, Duchamp scholars have traced back the title étant donné 1, the waterfall, 2, the illuminating gas, back prior to World War I. How is it possible that Duchamp could know about self-organizing systems? That's what I want to talk about today. So, I think I have now become lost. Okay. problem of interpreting étant donné and Duchamp's career is that it's hard to figure out how he's able to think these kinds of thoughts, and that's really the question I'm raising today. How can one represent as a historian of intellectual work across disciplines a moment when it's possible to think a certain kind of thought? And it turns out that Duchamp read very carefully both Poincaré and Bergson. Very carefully. And in fact, on mathematical discovery, one can find actual vocabulary that Duchamp uses from this essay on mathematical creativity and scientific creativity in his own writings on artistic creativity. To sum up very briefly what On Mathematical Discovery does is Poincaré confronts the limits of mathematical inquiry while posing the potential of mathematical inquiry. He doesn't want to limit mathematical invention to mere computation, figuring, to use a bad pun. Because actually, well, we'll talk about that in a second. First of all, he wants to talk about a particular moment in time when he had a sudden realization, much like what Bazarov was talking about yesterday with respect to epiphany. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And what I would like to do is to suggest that this essay is an exploration of what happened to him when he had this epiphany with respect to the relationship between Gaussian functions, no, Fuchsian functions, correct, and non-Euclidean geometry. He labored and labored and labored on Fuchsian functions in order to understand them, and in a moment of repose suddenly realized that the algebraic expressions of Fuchsian mathematics actually help to model non-Euclidean geometry, which maybe some of you know came into being in the mid-19th century amid much celebration among the mathematical and scientific community, as well as artists and philosophers. So it was part of the vocabulary of the moment, including the vocabulary of Duchamp, as laid out in my friend Linda Henderson's 1983 volume, The Fourth Dimension in Non-Euclidean Geometry in Modern Art, and elaborated further in her more recent volume, Duchamp in Context, as well as the work of Craig Adcock, who wrote a monograph entitled The N-Dimensional Analysis of Large Glass, and other people who have done work in this area. So, what Poincaré comes up with is a theory of creativity which has been enormously influential in literature way beyond mathematics, and includes behavioral psychology, creativity theory, education, and on and on and on. You probably recognize the terms from this essay, and the essay is so famous because of the terms which many of you may understand, that the stages of mathematical creativity occur as follows. There's a stage of preparation where one does a lot of homework. There's a stage of incubation, which usually occurs after you're really frustrated by all the homework that you have to do. There is a moment where you take your mind off of business and you go hang out in the bathtub, or ride a train to some camp, and or sleep and have a dream of snakes biting their own tails, and all of a sudden there is an illumination. This illumination is a fully blown realization of the answer to the problem, which then requires simple computational verification, which represents the last bit of sweat. Oh, I'm sorry. I hope this does not screw up this. It may have done so.
What did it do? Your battery was done?
Excuse me?
Your battery down?
No, it's plugged in, but
But there, it's working okay there. Your problem is here.
what's interesting here is the description that Poincaré makes of the moment of illumination. And I think this is very telling for a number of reasons, including my interest in metaphor. He describes habitual computational mathematics and rigid paradigms within which mathematicians work as thoughts like atoms hooked to walls which remain rigid. And he uses the reference to Epicurus's hooked atoms. And this is the moment where the elements of the current mathematical knowledge are being manipulated. In a moment of illumination, these atoms become suddenly unhooked from the wall and start to fly around. And he actually describes this in terms of the kinetic theory of gases. So the connection between illumination and gas, which he refers to as, he doesn't use the word thermodynamics, but he's really talking about thermodynamic equilibrium. But it's interesting that his description takes on another element. And that is that for some reason, when these atoms, like the kinetic, these thoughts, like the kinetic theory of atoms, of gases, fly around, they can suddenly recoalesce in structures that were completely unpredictable from the current situation. And not only do the atoms become reconfigured, but this process is irreversible. Those atoms can never be hung up back on the walls in their original position again. And by implication, one could suggest that even the walls themselves can shift around. So two things can be suggested by this metaphor, which I will talk about more with reference to my discussion on Saturday morning. That this is a metaphor that opens portals into two different ways of thinking that largely did not exist before. First of all, he's describing equilibrium thermodynamic processes with association of the kinetic theory of gases in terms of emergent properties, in terms of processes of self-organization. So anticipating the work of Ilya Prigogine, and perhaps catalyzing, to use a current word, catalyzing Prigogine's own work in non-equilibrium thermodynamics. But we also have an analogy formation here, that there is an analogy between the self-organizing processes postulated as possible with entropic systems, non-equilibrium rather than equilibrium thermodynamics, and the behavior of cognition. Now, this essay, appeared in 1906. A number of years after Bergson's Creative Evolution, the first volume, which was published in English in 1911. I just forgot what I was going to say. Excuse me. But it also anticipates another kind of analogy, which was one that Maturana and Varela used in the 1960s when they looked at the work of Prigogine and Atlan and others, and suggested that maybe there was another way to think about biological and cognitive evolution. And they look, and Varela specifically mentions Prigogine in showing how the emergent properties paradigm emerged by analogy out of the work in self-organizing systems in the in the early 60s, the 50s and early 60s. So we have Poincaré using an analogy in 1906 that generates a whole new paradigm some 60 years later. But there's another word besides illuminating gas that we associate with Duchamp's writings on creativity, which is if you remember the term étant donné, the waterfall to the illuminating gas, refers to the 1968 work, as well as the notes for that conception, which date back to 1911 to 1913 is the earliest they've been able to do that. But there's another term that Duchamp shared with Poincaré, which is highlighted and bold-faced on Mathematical Discovery, and that is ready-made, and I was actually the one who discovered this. If you remember, Duchamp already created works of art simply by taking found objects and putting them on a pedestal and sticking them in a museum, or altering them slightly, like a bicycle wheel on a chair, and sticking that in a museum, or taking a urinal and turning it upside down and putting that into a museum. And for Duchamp, a ready-made is a work that requires no effort on the part of the artist or the observer. It requires an acceptance of the complicity of the fact that we assume it's art, because there's an agreement that anything in the space of a museum, on a pedestal or in a frame, should be considered art. What's interesting about the term ready-made in Poincaré is that ready-made refers to the world of mathematics and science, which can run on the basis of perpetual motion. It's like the machinery of thought that we associate with simple computation, rather than the moments of genius and insight which produce illumination. So the highlighted and bold-faced use of the word ready-made refers to, in a sense, a deterministic model of both thinking as well as the world itself. Now, this was a wonderful discovery, and in fact, a lot of people have rejected an appreciation of Duchamp's knowledge of Bergson by saying, Poincaré was the source for Duchamp, not Bergson. But in fact, tout fait, what did they know and when did they know it, is the next point that I want to make. Poincaré uses the word ready-made in this way, in terms of a deterministic trajectory of physical systems and thought systems. But Bergson uses it systematically in Creative Evolution, English translation, 1911, a number of years before that. In the famous essay on laughter, 1900. Matter and Memory, 1898, I think. I've got the dates a little bit off, I'm not sure. And even back to his first work on the immediate data of consciousness, which was his doctoral thesis in 1889. And used precisely in this way, in terms of the mechanistic perspective of physical systems and cultural systems. Okay. So we have a sense of this opposition between a deterministic frame of reference, in which which time is reversible, certainty is assumed, and everything runs mechanistically, and a thread which is subterranean and subdominant at the beginning of the century, but which has becoming the dominant paradigm in contemporary life, which is theories of self-organization in physical systems, cognitive systems, and cultural systems. So to complicate the situation a little bit further, it's assumed that Duchamp did not like Bergson because Bergson was misinterpreted badly, and as badly as Nietzsche was, and in fact became the darling of fascists and artistic aesthetic fascists like the putative Cubists, Metzinger and Gleitz. And so it's assumed that Duchamp wanted to distance himself. But what I would suggest is that Duchamp went to Poincaré because he recognized that what Poincaré was doing was interpreting Poincaré, his cognitive and cultural implications, much like Kant interpreted the cognitive and cultural implications of Newton and Leibniz. And let me just briefly talk about that. If you remember Kant, Kant's model of the manifold of consciousness involves the imagination, the judgment, and the reason. Cognition is dependent upon the reception of images or sensory input in the imagination. The imagination is not the imagination of Poincaré or the creativity of Poincaré. It's just the receptacle of impressions. Kant embraces the geometry of calculus of Newton and Leibniz, and therefore the reversible uncertainty implied by that, and assumed that the mind had a priori categories of time and space in a relational grid which spontaneously organized those sensations for the purposes of analyzing them in the judgment. It's interesting that a source of Bergson named Solomon Maimon, a Jewish theologian and philosopher, actually provided a critique of Kant during Kant's lifetime, where he challenged these a priori categories directly. And Kant read Maimon's work and commented quite favorably and generously on Maimon's revision of Kant's manifold. Solomon Maimon's work becomes important for Bergson because what Bergson wants to do is to recuperate a level of cognition that is not bound by clock time and calculus. Bergson, in his earlier works, and especially in Matter and Memory and Creative Evolution, postulates a form of dialectic by which cognitive and even biological systems are governed. He argues that the ground state of the universe is contingent and irreversible. He calls that durée réelle, or contingent duration. And in réel, I think there's some reverberation with what you're calling the real. Bazara. This contingent duration is in dialectical relationship to what he calls matter. Oh, I'm sorry. No, with respect to memory. And memory is encoded not only in thoughts, but also in matter itself. And that there is a dialectic between contingent duration and memory within biological systems as well as cognitive systems. And then he argues, and most people have interpreted this as a form of metaphysics, he postulates a kind of principle of creativity, which he calls élan vital, a vital impetus, which was horribly misunderstood. It even became the basis for encouraging French soldiers to march into the slaughterhouse of World War I by arguing that the French generals actually argued that it's possible to overcome machine guns and the statistical certainty of 88 to 92% casualties if you end up in a killing zone through the élan, or the vital spirit of the French, what do you call it, morale. That's how bad it got with Bergsonianism. But to make a simple point, the elements of these represent a theory of evolution based on contingency, and therefore represents a remarkably sophisticated precursor to what we now understand as self-organizing systems theory. Okay, so I argue that Bergson interprets Poincaré because what Bergson does is, first of all, he critiques how dominated we are by clock time and calculus. He argues that we are so dominated by the habitual rituals of the mind, which have been superimposed upon us by calculus, clock time, and the Industrial Revolution, that we've lost touch with who we are. And who we are is contingent duration. That is the ground state of our awareness. And he says that we are so dominated by this that it's almost impossible to get out of it. And in fact, there's a whole series of books, pretty good books, by a guy named Marcel Proust, who attempts to really construct the strain of trying to recover a moment, which you could use the word Poincaréan illumination, or the moment of the experience of contingent duration associated with some flour and tannic acid, or cake and tea. That's why Deleuze, among others, have forced the English translation, recherche, to not remembrance of things past, but in search of lost contingent time. This fascination with the critique of geometry and a desire to conceptualize as well as to model how to experience contingent duration despite the hegemony of clock time and calculus. And if I just interrupt with a brief historical parenthesis, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the insane asylums of England were filled to capacity because all the people displaced on the farms that had to work in the factories could not coordinate their life experience with the behavior of machines. I'm sorry. And the ritual of having to be at a certain place at a certain time in order to perform work, in order to earn money, in order to survive, which they were able to do simply by following the rhythms of the seasons when they were peasants. So this is the context for understanding Bergson's project. He wants to make us flexible enough, in Poincaré's language, and I argue that Poincaré's On Mathematical Discovery is influenced by Bergson as Bergson was influenced by Poincaré. That in a moment. Where this goes with Poincaré is that Poincaré, in his explorations of non-Euclidean geometry, and I'm going to have to do this very quickly, discovered that the movement from the kind of geometry that we do to build buildings is not the only geometry there is. The work of Lobachevsky and Riemann and others demonstrated that there was a whole range of geometries that one could construct if one assumed, for example, that a straight line is not necessarily straight. So Poincaré was able to prove that given the world, that one could conceivably construct any given geometry to explain the world, and that would be as good as any other geometry. This is called conventionalism, and I'm oversimplifying for the purposes of time, but what's interesting is that there was a limit to Poincaré's embrace of the conventionalist model, and this involved a debate with Bergson that took place in the Academy, both between them and through the mediation of both Poincaré and Bergson's student Leroy, L-E-R-O-Y, who actually argued for a hard or nominalist interpretation of geometry versus Poincaré's more careful modulated conventionalism grounded by inductive reasoning, which he considered to be invariant, that the procedures of inductive reasoning were invariant even if none of the geometries were invariant or permanent or a priori. In other words, Poincaré unmoored Kant and Leibniz and the history of the role of Euclidean geometry in physics by demonstrating that those categories are socially constructed and not essential to man's cognitive capabilities. This is what Bergson picks up in his critique of culture and runs with it. Now, Poincaré did his own critique of Kant in order to rein in Bergson and Bergson's protégés, and Bergson also was horrified by a lot of the ways in which Bergson's ideas were being used. But in any case, the problem of how we see is the problem of how dominated we are by clock time and calculus, and how it becomes possible to free us from those strictures and to recover an originary contingent duration, which gives us a sense of possibility. Now, what I would argue is that what Bergson is doing is not really metaphysics here in the sense that we associate it with transcendence and theosophy, but what he's doing is trying to model creativity and intuition by defining intuition not as irrationalism, as Bertrand Russell tried to force the definition onto Bergson, but that intuition is the ability to recognize possible alternative futures. Let me point to two passages where Bergson's comments on contemporary mathematics seems to bear this out. First quote, "Modern mathematics is precisely an effort to substitute for the ready-made what is in the process of becoming." Creative evolution. No, I'm sorry, not creative evolution, but that's the creative mind, which is 1903, published first in French in 1903. And as I pointed out, ready-made as a term goes all the way back to his first published monograph in 1889. Second quote. The purpose of this kind of mathematics, which, let me repeat, modern mathematics is precisely an effort to substitute for the ready-made what is in the process of becoming, is in order to seize movement no longer from outside, top-down control, and in its manifest result, and thus modeling a deterministic model of cause and effect, but from within and in its tendency towards change. So intuition is the perception enabled by contingent duration to perceive moments of forks in the road where there are possible alternative futures available to the creative mind. However, how do you get there from here? As the Vermont farmer would say, is an old, there are Vermont farmer jokes, which is probably not the context here. But let me simply say that Duchamp's works seem to work out the problem of this, not simply to allegorize and therefore to valorize and therefore to propagandize self-organization as a paradigm, although the portal into a new world might suggest that he was at least charmed by the possibility that this might be a new paradigm. But two of his works seem to illustrate, Duchamp's work seems to illustrate the problems that we face in order to try to recover that lost contingent time beneath the habitual rituals of mind that Bergson wants to relocate. I'm almost out of time. Am I out of time? Let me just stop in 2 minutes. I'll stop in. No, because I want to make sure there are lots of time for questions. Let me stop in 2 minutes. Bergson actually tries to construct a model of the processes for cognizing events that has resonances with what Bazarov was modeling on the board. And he talks about the constraints of our awareness that are socially constructed, and he calls them the time image and the movement image. He says that we tend to organize the world and to break up the world in terms of a series of states. He actually says that we perceive things as discontinuous single moments. Let me come back briefly to chess. What is the game of chess? We have two players viewing a system. And the system represents a tug of war between two subjectivities over the future trajectory of the system. And how is that system organized? What we have is a move represented by a single static moment, which is then contemplated by the two players as they project in their minds possible alternative futures from one moment to the next. So chess, in effect, models calculus, right? Infinitesimal calculus, individual, discontinuous, static moments. And Bergson says that the mind has an inevitable tendency to the condition of geometry. He's describing the fact that we are captured by geometry, that we spatialize time in our modeling, in our cognition of the world around us. I promise you I'm not doing that to you folks. I hope you're not doing it to me. In any case, the time image is the image by which we recognize our incapacity to sustain the experience of contingency without breaking it up into individual units, the grossest manifestation with which is the blinking of the eye, which one could associate with the shutter of a camera. And the work from 1918, to be looked at from the other side of the glass with one eye close to for almost an hour, give me a break. Here we go, double sass. Okay. Sorry. This is a work that you can find in the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. And what we have is an interesting work. You have basically at the top an n-dimensional model of a pyramid, which is the classic geometric representation of the top-down computational system, the organization of a university, the military, a totalitarian state, the division classification system of the library, and the organization of your hard drive into directories and subdirectories and sub-subdirectories and sub-sub-subdirectories, which is the arboreal structure of thinking, which the rhizome represents the antithesis. I shouldn't use the antithesis because I don't want to suggest a dialectical relationship. Here you have a crystal balanced, a hole with a piece of glass balanced on the edge of a crystal with two circles, one high, one low, suggesting perhaps hierarchy. But the problem is that this piece got broken, so you have contingent lines throughout the entire piece, like there is in large glass, representing its accidental contingent breakage. So the pyramid represents geometry. What's interesting is that you can actually walk behind this and actually look at from the other side of the glass. And if you stare through this little hole in glass, you get an inversion of yourself, a mirror inversion upside down, much like the folding of the chessboard. But further all, if you're staring with one eye close to that eye, a lot of people are going to look at you really strangely. And if you're there for almost an hour staring out through that hole, you may attract the attention of the security guards. But what I'm more interested in is what you would be seeing if you could keep your eye open, staring without blinking for almost an hour. What you see is undifferentiated flow. So this work is a model to challenge your ability to perceive not discontinuous units of spatialized time, but continuous flow and contingent flow. Where was I? Oh, here we go. Okay. If you remember his most famous work, which was at the Armory Show in 1913 in New York, what's called The Bride Descending a Staircase. I don't have an image, I'm sorry, I don't have an image for it. But what you have is basically what seems to be a standard Cubist work of a woman descending a staircase. But what's interesting about this is that it scandalized both the Cubists and the Futurists. Why? Because he knew that he was making fun of them both. Why was he making fun of them both? Simply, Cubists represented four-dimensional reality, but their interpretation of four-dimensional reality is divorced from time. They were using pre-Einsteinian fourth dimension theory, as well as and not really understanding Bergson at all. While the Futurists wanted to represent the acceleration of time. But as we know, the acceleration of time does not preclude instantaneous calculus, and in fact the purpose of instantaneous calculus is to be able to account not only for trajectory in time but also for acceleration. So he was spoofing both Cubism and Futurism in this particular work. But what's more interesting is that this represents the movement image, the fact that when we look at things moving, our inevitable tendency towards the condition of geometry forces us to perceive that as an infinite series of still frames, which is what the work parodies. Which brings us to large glass and the machinery of desire and the relationship between the bachelor apparatus and the bride, who could be identified with the splayed woman in a tontone. The machinery of desire described by the bachelor apparatus is the machinery of the Industrial Revolution, where we have the reversible laws of dynamics dominating the irreversible processes of thermodynamics and the kinetic theory of gases in order to produce work. And so much of Duchamp's scholarship involves trying to interpret his interpretation of the iconography of this machinery. But what's interesting is that after he constructed this work, he took a toy cannon and shot a pencil at it. And in the pencil, contingently, there emerged what might be considered a Poisson equation of distributed random dots that occurred through the firing of the cannon. And at each point marked by the pencil fired by the cannon, he drilled a hole. And what is that hole? The hole is a portal. In our habitual rituals of the mind, we are engaged in the machinery of desire. If we want to Platonize it, it can be the desire for sex and procreation, the desire for power, and the desire for the intellective or the desire for knowledge. If you don't want to Platonize it, it's the question of being dominated by a certain model of the world, encapsulated by both technology of machinery as well as technology of computation associated with the reversible perspective of physics. But if those holes drilled into the large glass take our attention away from the machinery of desire, which is the dominant paradigm in 1923, and then becomes the way in which Duchamp can illustrate through a tableau a new paradigm, then the hole in the glass becomes the chink in the door, and we are back to the beginning of my talk again. And let me stop there, except by suggesting that the role of metaphor in science can be talked about in terms of portals, and that will be the focus of my discussion on tomorrow. Same time, same station. Thank you very much. They want me to step away because of the interference of the laptop with are there any?
Okay, I will speak in Portuguese, okay?
Okay.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yes. Nelson, Instituto de Física, University of São Paulo. Ok, eu vou fazer dois comentários e uma questão. O primeiro comentário diz respeito, talvez até uma sugestão, que você evocou Prigogine e Varela. Mas, para minha surpresa, quer dizer, eu esperava que você evocasse os aspectos criativos dessas visões. Deixe-me explicar. O cerne do pensamento de Prigogine, com relação aos sistemas termodinâmicos longe do equilíbrio, é justamente que, longe do equilíbrio, é impossível estabelecer-se um princípio geral que o sistema se submeteria a este sistema.
Local systems only. Yeah.
Yes. Longe do equilíbrio, então, não há um princípio geral e nós devemos usar as ferramentas, seja...
Could you slow down? Could you slow down a little bit? Thank you.
Nós devemos usar as ferramentas da teoria do caos e da auto-organização para tratar cada caso. Abre-se, assim, uma perspectiva criativa em sistemas termodinâmicos longe do equilíbrio, no qual nós podemos considerar a própria arte como um sistema longe do equilíbrio, aberto, como você bem colocou. Então, este aspecto é uma sugestão e me parece que tem a ver com o processo criativo. Com relação a Varela, você colocou a linha cognitivista e a linha conexionista, no seu resuminho de Varela. E você certamente conhece, mas não citou, a abordagem inactive approach de Varela, que vai trazer, então, o caráter criativo e ontológico da criação, no momento em que introduz a questão do senso comum, uma cognição baseada no senso comum, que, a meu ver, também é muito poderosa para se considerar a questão da arte e dos processos criativos. Então, este é um primeiro comentário.
Excellent. Excellent.
Um segundo comentário diz respeito a uma frase sua em que eu compreendi perfeitamente, e não estou criticando, eu compreendi o gerar. Você disse que a analogia de Poincaré, de 1906, então, gera um paradigma novo 60 anos mais tarde. Eu entendi relativizada essa afirmação, porque, na verdade, a história da auto-organização ela é mais complicada. Afirmar-se isto seria o mesmo que dizer que os desenvolvimentos da teoria dos fractais e do caos são geradas por Poincaré. Na verdade, elas têm uma história própria e depois nós sentimos essa capacidade antecipatória de Poincaré ao estabelecer os fractais um século quase antes. A auto-organização tem uma história muito curiosa, porque ela é proposta pela primeira vez pelos cibernéticos, nos anos 50. E nos anos 50, os cibernéticos propõem a auto-organização.